This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Steve Bhaerman, who is also known as Beyondananda. He's an internationally known author, humorist, and workshop leader. Steve, or I think I'm going to call you Beyondananda. Thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today.
Well, very good, thank you. I have the Swami Beyondananda here with me. I can change costumes at the flick of a flick because we're on radio.
Very good.
Well, we'll just imagine you putting on a turban.
That's right. The Swami is turban-powered. I'm just sort of an ordinary person.
Okay, Steve, let us fill in our audience, some of whom are familiar with your character, Swami Beyondananda, some are not. You have a life independent of the Swami as a humorist and a lecturer on humor. How did a nice boy from Brooklyn become a humor maven, a humorist, and how did that segue into Swamidom?
Well, let's just say I am a boy from Brooklyn. I'm not sure how nice that is. Something about Brooklyn makes people laugh. Maybe it's the water that they used for the water bagels. I'm not sure what. But there's something in New York that cultivates sense of humor, and it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. You know, there's great Irish humorists and great, black, Puerto Rican, Italian. It all kind of came together in New York. There's something about that. Maybe everybody being bunched up against one another that creates kind of a pressure, and the best way to relieve and release that pressure is through humor. So I was very, very fortunate to grow up in a family where people laughed. They laughed a lot. And I just remember being a little kid at my grandparents' little apartment in Brooklyn and just listening to everybody laugh and tell jokes and eat and drink and be merry. And my dad was a very funny guy. He wasn't a professional comedian, but I noticed that his humor really was much more about bringing people together rather than putting people down. And so at a very, very early age, I just began to love comedy. And I was the class comedian, and the way that you know that that's your archetype, you're chosen for that. It's the first time you're in the lunchroom and you make another kid laugh so hard that milk comes out of their nose, and then that's a sign from God. And I was a kid. I ignored that, when I became an adult, because all of us are told to grow up, to get serious, and so on. And I was pursuing a serious career, which sounds kind of funny. I was started an alternative high school in Washington, D.C., wrote a book called No Particular Place to Go, published by Simon & Schuster, about my experiences. I was an educator. I was teaching at Wayne State University in Detroit, labor history and ethnic studies. And a funny thing happened, which when you say that, a funny thing happens, sometimes it's funny and sometimes it isn't. And this time it wasn't. I got laid off from my dream job, which I loved. And the only job I could get, because I had at one point lived on a farm and learned how to operate heavy equipment, I got a job with the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan, taking down trees that had Dutch elm disease. And my Jewish mother in Brooklyn, she became very concerned, and I'm not making this up, this is true, that I would catch Dutch elm disease. And I said, Mom, people don't get Dutch elm disease, dogs get it. She goes, dogs get it. What happens to dogs? I said, they lose their bark. So
I got it.
With my mom, you had to do that, So anyway, so I'm at this job, and I'm writing a serious book, again, a sequel on education, looking for a way out of getting up every morning, putting on a jumpsuit and a hard hat and chipping brush. And I just get this message, and the message is, I hear a voice, actually, and I don't normally hear voices, and the voice was, let this go. Well, I let it go, and the message continued, the book you're working on education, that's the past. You need to focus on the future. I said, cool. What's the future? Nothing. But a few weeks later, they put a new guy with me who is a brilliant psychologist disguised as a truck driver. And as amazing grace would have it, he made a suggestion to me that we start an anonymous humorist newspaper for the guys we worked with. And that's what happened. And in the course of the year or so that I worked on this paper while I was working at the shop, I noticed that the workplace was transformed because of humor. First of all, we infused novelty. We disrupted life as the ordinary. That was number one. Number two, we were able to say things that could not be said. We were able to say them in humor. And the lesson that I learned in that two-year period of time that I was writing that publication was, my goodness, humor really is transformational. It transmutes all kinds of energy. We could talk a little bit more about the alchemy of humor as we go on, but it transmutes all kinds of energy. And then number two, I was really good at it. This was my gift, and this is what I was here to do. And so very shortly after, I started a publication, a holistic publication in Ann Arbor called Pathways, and we decided we needed humor, and Swami became our mascot, our delivery system for humor. And that's really how this character began and how I got set on the path from being a serious professor to a humorous purveyor.
Steve, your humor is based on spirituality or those seeking spirituality and everything that surrounds that. And I'm curious, and I'm going to guess over the years, you've been exposed to many, many spiritual movements and groups throughout the U.S. Do you generally find that those spiritual seekers are more, that laughter, that humor is a part of their spiritual path, whether they know it or not? Because sometimes we think of spiritual seekers as being very solemn monks in a monastery, never cracking a smile, very serious all the time. But in fact, my experience is when I've been around various spiritual groups, there's often an element of, a significant element of humor. And if it's a spiritual group that's guru-centric, that level of humor is usually dependent upon the guru and his sort of attitude toward humor. I'm wondering what your experience is in regard to that, your observations.
Well, okay, that's a big question. Let me back up to when I first started doing this. What I noticed that there were two common afflictions that the spiritual people that I met had. And, this ran the gamut from people who followed various Hindu gurus to people who were quote-unquote New Age. And the two afflictions, I would call pathological purity. And pathological purity is where you feel like there's something that's impure about you. I mean, I knew people, they wore white, they only ate white food. I mean, there's all kinds of, fasting, don't do this, don't do that. Basically going to asceticism and cleaning up. And, so I saw that one extreme. There was a lot of that. On the other hand, we saw what I would call spiritual materialism, where people would learn how to chant and then chant for a BMW. So those were the two kinds of extremes. I always found that there was something disarming about the humor that I did, and that even if people were serious, they would laugh in spite of themselves. And the first time I had an opportunity to actually perform in front of a real Swami, it was rather intimidating. It was Swami Satchidananda at Yogaville, the ashram, Lotus Shrine in Virginia. And, of course, here I am. This is 25 years ago or more, so I'm a phony Swami about to go and do a performance in front of a real Swami. So the night before, we went to his satsang, and he said, "What if you want to achieve enlightenment, you must desire nothing." Well, at the time, I had just produced the box of nothing, a very colorful box that had lots of jokes about nothing, a hole in the box to see how much nothing you had left, blah, blah, blah. And so the next night he came to the show. And at the end of the show, I very ceremoniously presented him with a box of nothing to help him get enlightened. And when he had his 85th birthday party 5 years later, he invited me to do my nothing presentation because he was so tickled by it. Now, Sajjidananda, like the Maharishi, like the Dalai Lama, these are all people who laugh very easily, mainly because they take themselves lightly, mainly because they see the silliness in so much of the ego's antics and activities. But as you were suggesting, what I noticed when I was doing my show for Sajjidananda is that the close disciples looked at the boss to see if the boss was laughing.
Exactly.
He had no problem laughing at all of this. He definitely recognized the depth of humor when it comes to the human condition. And it's just everybody else who was more tied into the structure of the path rather than the essence of it.
That's interesting.
As Westerners often are.
Steve, do you find people in spiritual circles capable more or less than the average person, or just a regular audience, of self-deprecating humor, of being able to accept being satirized themselves? My own experience is that many people are more frightened than enlightened when it comes to things like that.
Well, again, it really depends on who comes to the shows. I mean, obviously, if somebody is taking this thing so seriously, Swami calls it the humoroids. If they've got humoroids, an enlargement of the onus, where they feel so responsible they can only pass heavy judgments, then those people will select themselves out. I think that there's something about the playfulness of the kind of humor that I've learned how to do in the guise of the Swami character, that coaxes out through surprise and delight. When people are surprised, they burst out laughing, even if they don't mean to.
Yeah.
And once that happens, then everybody kind of discovers that, well, everybody else is laughing. One of the most difficult shows I ever did had nothing to do with spirituality. It was for, believe it or not, the juvenile justice system in Colorado. And somebody invited me to speak at one of their conferences, and there were all of the people who were involved with juvenile detention centers and juvenile advocates and the entire hierarchy from top to bottom. And what happened was everybody was afraid to laugh because the people looked at the folks who were their superiors, and they weren't comfortable laughing in that presence, and then the other ones looked at those who were their underlings, and they couldn't laugh. So we had a very, very uncomfortable hour as people were too uncomfortable to laugh because they didn't feel safe inside the structure of their workplace. In terms of spiritual things, I remember one time, very, very, very early on in doing this, about 1987, almost 30 years ago, it was a little metaphysical church in Arlington, Virginia. And I'm doing my thing, and the audience is sitting there stone-faced. It was like, you ever play Mount Rushmore? It was like playing Mount Rushmore. And there were two guys off in the corner laughing hysterically, but everybody else was just stone-faced. And well, I met the two guys who were laughing, and one of them turned out to be Patch Adams, so we've been friends now since then. But the other people they never laughed. And so when a couple of days later, we went back to the church to get our check from the minister, and we were surprised to find that it was more than what we agreed on. And I said, what's more than what we said? He says, oh, I know. They loved you. Well, they didn't tell their faces.
Wow.
Why was that? Why didn't they? Yeah.
Virginia.
No, but why? Why do you think they didn't react?
I think that maybe they didn't understand it was comedy. Sometimes I've done programs where the MC or the host decides that they're gonna pretend that I'm a real spiritual master, and then I never let them do that anymore, because what that does is it puts people in confusion during the first 5, 10, 15 minutes of the performance, and they miss out on really enjoying the humor and really letting themselves go and laugh and shake loose all of these structures and shoulds and oughts and all of that other stuff. And so that happened a while back, and for the second program I did for those people, I said, please let them know I'm the cosmic comic. And the reaction and response was entirely different than that first time, when you could see a look of confusion because they were told that this is a great spiritual teacher, and he's standing up there doing stand-up.
Along those lines, I would like to ask Swami how, if he's ever had any interesting reactions from people who hail from India.
Well, it very often doesn't hail in India. They don't have it. No, I think that they recognize a kindred spirit. Often I've looked out, and I go, look out, because there's all these people that look like they're from India. Mm-hmm. And so I go, well, I hope they don't think I'm making fun of them. But when they come up afterward, they say, oh, that was really, really funny.
Right.
Very good.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, this is interesting, because I got to tell you something. The people who I've had the most trouble with are these politically correct people from Berkeley or Ithaca or places like that, where they project. I actually had this happen. One of the first times I was doing a radio show in Berkeley, and I didn't know this, but anyway, I'm on as a Swami. And somebody else called in, and the two of us are going back and forth, and he was obviously putting on a Swami accent, and they're going back like this, back and forth. What I didn't know is that the engineer was African American, and he's just tearing his hair out. He's going, make them stop doing that. Make them stop doing that. Because he projected his own, we can't make fun of those people, and he just assumed that the people from India would think that I was making fun of them, but they don't have the same wound related to that.
Right. It's interesting, Phil.
And in this, there's a lot of healing, and I think I know we're going to talk a little about the election later, but I think one of the things that I really, really hope is now up for question is political correctness. Swami says political correctness is politically incorrect, because what happens is you put up this thou shalt not say these words, these words, these words, and these words, and not only does it bring out the rebellious 9-year-old in every boy, but what it also does is it really prevents a true, honest conversation, and it preempts heartfelt respectfulness by forcing one to speak a certain way, even if you don't feel that way. And I think that we've now, laid open the wound for everybody in this so-called civilization. All the nicey that we've put on top of it, it's now been revealed, and now we actually have to have a real healing conversation.
Along those lines, Steve, in regard to what you do in speaking to spiritual groups, are there lines that you are afraid to cross? Like, in other words, making jokes about the guru, if it's a guru-centric movement? Because my experience is that that's very sensitive in most of those groups.
Well, the idea of humor, when it's done right, is humor is never oppositional. Humor is a lot like a keto. Humor doesn't push against something. It just simply finds a way around it that is delightful and surprising. So the way that I did very early on, my good friend Phil Proctor from Firesign Theater, they first had the GURU, And so I took that and I created the Guru rap song. Gee, you are you. So when I look at when I've spoken in front of those groups and people ask about the Guru, I say, well, you want to look at the true Guru, look in the mirror and go, gee, you are you. Gee, you are you. Nobody can argue with that. It doesn't push against anything. It doesn't insult the Guru. It doesn't disrespect the people who find that form of devotion helpful to them. So over the years, as I've performed in front of various groups, I mean, there's a number of things that, the way that my mind works, my mind has no censorship. It's between the mind and the lips is where I have to decide what am I going to do. So as a good example, maybe 13 years ago or so, I'm performing at a very open-minded church in Vancouver, BC. And somebody asked about a guy, he probably was gay, he asked about gay marriage. And the Swami said, well, you know, I think gay men are coming into their own. And there was a silence, and then all of a sudden the whole place came down. The entire structure, I mean, everybody just burst out laughing. They couldn't control themselves. And, of course, the Swami did like a Jack Benny, like, what did I say, what did I say? Mm-hmm. Now, that was 13 years ago. This question comes up a lot. I have used that line only 5 times since that time because I've had to very, very carefully gauge my audience to see whether they are willing to go all the way or whether I would have to dig myself out of a hole. I have a friend, Alicia Datner, a very talented young comedian, and, you know, she says, the comedy club is sacred space. What does she mean? As in the Native American Heyoki, the Native American trickster clown, in that culture, the joker is always wild. The joker always trumps everything. And in the space of a comedy club, in that sacred space, just as surely as the jester was allowed to say anything to the king, in the space of comedy, between consenting adults, you can go anywhere in that space of comedy. You can actually explore things that are taboo. You can say things that are forbidden. And when you do that, you have the tremendous opportunity for deconstructing ideas that are obsolete. And I'll give you another example that's not my own. At his first, Lenny Bruce, and I'm sure most people who are listening know who Lenny Bruce was, but he was a very edgy comedian in the 50s to the mid-60s. You know, he was called a dirty comedian. He was the first to use these 4-letter words in his performance. He was arrested. He was persecuted, et cetera, et cetera. So Lenny Bruce is doing his first performance in New York. He had made his name on the West Coast in San Francisco. His reputation preceded him. Maybe the late 1950s, I'm thinking. And he's at a club in New York, and again, who's there? It was one of these jazz clubs. So he's got the beatniks, he's got the intellectuals, and he has a few celebrities. And in the front row is the great basketball player Wilt Chamberlain and his date, and Sammy Davis Jr. and his date. And so very early on in the show, Lenny Bruce wants to light a cigarette. So he asks Wilt Chamberlain to pass his cigarette so he could light his cigarette. And he looks at the cigarette that Wilt Chamberlain passed, and he says, "You've been nigger-lipping this." And the entire crowd, nobody breathed until Wilt Chamberlain and Sammy Davis Jr. burst out laughing, and the entire place came down, and the idiocy of that phrase got deconstructed. Now, I'm saying this, I'm not trying to be offensive to anybody. I'm simply talking in quotes and saying something that happened, 55 years ago or so. to indicate that Lenny Bruce took this really very risky risk, knowing intrinsically that the audience didn't think he was racist. And so as a shaman, as a disruptor of the ordinary, he was able to say something in a context that would get it heard in a completely different way and point out the absurdity of the phrase as it is. And,
but let me interrupt, Steve. There's always the risk that Will Chamberlain wouldn't have taken it well and would have been offended. And then where does the comedian go with that? It's easier said than done. And I don't know that it works all the time.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's why I say he took a tremendous risk, because if he didn't get that response, it would have been a big uh-oh. And that's why in the split second when I have to decide whether I use this piece of material or go for that piece of material, I'm gauging whether whether people in the audience are going to be hurt or confused or disturbed in a bad way. You know, some ideas deserve to be disturbed, you know, but I don't really, but I'm not looking to cause hurt in what I do. You know, it's kind of like the opposite of the neutron bomb, you know, destruct ideas, leave humans standing, you know.
Steve, when you're performing as Swami, do you have intention beyond just entertainment, beyond just making people laugh? Is there an agenda, not an agenda, but is there, as part of your sort of mission or your raison d'etre for having the character of Swami Beyondananda, to illuminate, to enlighten, to move people along spiritually, or is it just entertainment?
Well,
Not that there's anything wrong with just entertainment.
Well, entertainment is good. You know, when you talk about raison d'etre, yes, I'm in debt. I have to go out and make money and do my show. No, no, not that. But actually, it's funny that the character Swami Beyondananda essentially defined how and what he says, and it brought out a part of me that was kind of more reticent. You know, coming from New York, I learned how to insult people through humor. I was really good. I had, I was a tongue fu master, you know, and I definitely was really good at that. When the Swami character showed up, there was naturally wisdom underneath what he was saying. It just made the humor, it gave the humor more depth. So, and you know, don't get even, get odd. There's wisdom in that. Drive your karma, curb your dogma. When you see a sacred cow, milk it for all it's worth. You know, it's not just funny lines. It's about something.
Right.
It's about something. And so that was how it began. And so in a certain regard, I've often read books and listened to talks, done practices, and then I've translated those into humor, using humorous terms to actually describe what I've learned so that it becomes useful and memorable to other people. So while they're being entertained, they're being offered something deeper. And people always say that, and I think one of the reasons why people from India have never taken offense at what I do and why they always come up very kindly is because they really recognize that it is a delivery system for something deeper than just throwaway lines. And
very good.
Yeah. Let me ask you.
It gives comedy more power.
Yeah. One final question from my side, Steve, and that is, you've been exposed to many different spiritual groups in your career as a comedian. Is there any group or groups that you were really taken by and thought, maybe even wanted to become part of, because you were so affected by them or their teacher or their teaching?
Other than Scientology.
Yeah, I'm not, I guess I respond to individual audiences, and I always appreciate, in fact, we just did a show at a big Unity church in Roanoke, Virginia, and I was so taken by that audience. They were so ready to play. And I think that's really what it is. Whatever, it's kind of like, I'll have what they're having. Whatever, if there's some path, some group, and I think often it's not so much the teacher, or it's how people have cultivated flexibility and good nature around those teachings. And I think part of what the Swami and comedy has sought to do is to really play with paradox, because that's the place of enlightenment, being able to hold opposites simultaneously. And so the kind of humor, when I first started doing this, everybody was like, you should be non-judgmental. So Swami would say, I think judging is terrible, and people who blame are the cause of all the world's problems. So you would take that, you would, I call it pumping ironies, as you take things that are contradictory and you bring them to consciousness, and all people can do is laugh about it. And then sometimes, one more thing along those lines is that I can tell when people lighten up. When I first started doing this, I went to this one group of the Florida Macrobiotic Association I performed in front of, and they were wonderful people. But when I walked in there, I was shocked, because these people were emaciated. It looked like I was witnessing the liberation of a concentration camp. They were so sickly and pale and just sick-looking people. Well, I came back there about 5 years later, and everybody looked much better. And Swami says, "Oh, you look so good, you must be cheating on your diets." And everybody laughed, because indeed they had released some of the rigidity that they had about their diet. They broadened their diet, and they became healthier and happier by doing that.
One last question I have for Swami.
Yes.
We are recording this exactly a week after Election Day 2016, and I'd really like to know if Swami has any words of wisdom for a nation in shock.
Well, I would have to say this, that evolution has played its trump card. I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the Bible, when it talks about the end times, a sign that the end times are here, it says the final trump shall blow. Okay?
Oh.
Well, many people are thinking, well, we think the trump blows. That's for certain. Well, what is the evolutionary moment? It means that we actually are being called forth to recognize the unity of who we are, that we are not that. He is the contrast. For years we have had the kind face on our empire, and yet underneath it, the same big fat ass. Yes? And so now, as people have come to realize, we've had a sociopathic empire with a nicey face on top of it. Why not have a real sociopath in charge? So that is where we are right now. And in order for us to actually gather around the virtues and values that the vast majority of us who are not sociopaths have in common, we have to compost this election. Yes, because a lot of the posts that I've been seeing have not been very calm. So we begin to compost by writing calmer posts, because what happens is when we get so into this fear, this fight or flight, it takes us out of our creative brain, puts us in our hindbrain. So we have to say to our hindbrain, "Get thee behind me, hindbrain," and let's go to the membrane and the woman brain, the frontal brain, where we are all in this together. And so we must stand like calm posts, sturdy, steadfast in the ground, holding for what we believe, that we are each and all cells in the body of one unified humanity, and that the kinds of fighting against one another is a form of autoimmune dysfunction. We must recognize that we are here for life, liberty, justice, thrival for all. And as we remember who we are, we will be able to not have a revolutionary uprising to overthrow this system. We will have an evolutionary upwising to overgrow this system.
Very good. An upwising. I like it. Thank you.
Very good.
Swamiji.
Thank you so very much. A lull in the storm this week. So we'll look, and we will post your website, so those that would like to see you perform will know your schedule, and you have written books, and all that information will be up. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, guys, for having me, and we look forward to this upwising taking place as more and more people take a step forward. As they go down, we go up, and we take everybody with us.
Great.
Thanks, Steve.
Great.